At closing on April 20th, the buyer assumed a $53,437.50 loan at 8% interest. His next payment is due on May 1st. Which of the following is true? Remember, when a buyer assumes a loan, there's no skip in payments. The only thing that happens is the name on the loan changes. So this buyer is making a payment on May 1st, which pays interest in arrears for the month of April. However, the buyer didn't own the property for the whole month of April. That means that the seller had accumulated or accrued 20 days worth of interest. Since the seller will never pay this off, we need to take money at closing from the seller and give it to the buyer. So we need to have a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer equal to 20 days of interest. So we need to look at how to figure out our interest. If the principal balance is $53,437.50, we take that at the 8% interest and come up with an annual interest of $4,275. Now, since we pay interest monthly, we divide that by 12 months in a year and come up with $356.25 monthly interest. Now, the seller doesn't owe the whole month. They only owe part of the month. So we take that $356.25, we divide it by 30 days in the month, and we get $11.88 in interest per day. We then multiply that times the 20 days the seller owes and come up with $237.50. So we need an answer that says debit seller, credit buyer, $237.50. What was the seller's loan payoff on an October 10th closing if his 8% loan had a balance of $43,605 on October 1st? To figure out the loan payoff, we need to know the principal plus the interest accrued. So the seller has already accrued 10 days worth of interest. So we take the loan balance of $43,605 and we multiply it times the 8% interest for an annual interest of $3,488. We divide that by 12 months in a year to get monthly interest of $290.70. We further divide that by 30 days to get a daily interest of $9.69 per day. This is then multiplied by the 10 days the seller owes for $96.90. But the seller owes the interest plus the principal still outstanding. So the seller owes $43,605 plus $96.90. If we add those two together, we come up with approximately $43,702, which is our answer. A building was bought for $85,000 with 10% down on a loan for the balance. If the lender charged the buyer 2 discount points, how much cash did the buyer need? We need to do a closing statement, and we're talking about the buyer. Now we know the buyer bought the building and the sales price was $85,000. That is a debit to our buyer. The next thing we see is 10% down. 10% down is a little dangerous unless you think about it, because all 10% down tells us is they need a loan for 90% of the purchase price. The 10% down does not show up in the closing statement. So that tells us our loan, which is 90% of $85.50, will be a credit for $76,500. Also, the buyer had to pay 2 points. 1 point is 1% of the loan amount, so 2 points 0.02 times 76,500 gives us a cost of $1,530. I add my two columns and I get $86,530 in debits and $76,500 in credits. I subtract my credits from my debits, and that means that this buyer needs to get $10,030 at closing in order to complete the transaction. The 10% down is actually in this amount. It's not a line item on the closing statement, it's a result of the closing statement. A seller's sewer bill was $30 per quarter. Closing date is September 25th. How much will the seller pay at closing? Since it's asking how much the seller will pay at closing, we have to assume that the seller has not paid this bill. Closing date is September 25th, and the bill is paid per quarter. So what quarter is September 25th in? It's actually in the third quarter, which starts on July 1st and ends on September 30th. If a quarter is 90 days total, and the closing is on September 25th, that means that the seller has been using the sewer for 85 days. So we take the quarterly bill of $30 and we divide it by 90 days, which gives us 33 cents a day. We then multiply it by the 85 days the seller's used, and we come up with $28.05, which is closest to our answer of $28. If you look at your answers, since the total bill was $30, the amount that the seller owed couldn't be more than $30 because he's paying $30 each quarter, which means that two of your answers were not possible.